be some questions, so pay attention. So, Tom, thank you.
Well, thank you all for having us. We got into town late yesterday afternoon, and such a warm welcome. I'm very grateful. Lynn and Mark have been wonderful hosts, and it's exciting to be in this building. Just to think that, well, 100 years ago or so, well, more than or so, a fellow that we, I think, all respect tremendously was a part of this community, this congregation. I had to laugh just a little bit when Mark sent me the flyer that described me as a Ray County historian. I worked at Bryan College for 21 years or so, and historians were the guys that had the PhD and wrote the books and all this. I've read a lot of history. My mother kind of pounded it into us kids, and I love history, but historian is a little generous, but thank you so much. Talking about the Scopes trial is, wow, where do you begin and where do you end? I think the easiest way to really describe it, I'm trying to make sure that I punch the right button here, is the Scopes trial, you could very easily say, was a publicity stunt that got out of hand. Not just Dayton, there were others involved. In 1925, the Dayton Coal and Iron Company had been bankrupt for about 12 years. This is a picture of the blast furnaces and other stuff that was involved with that. It had gone bankrupt in 1913 after grandiose visions of becoming a major employer. It was a major employer, a major economic engine in the South. Well, it was that way for a very short time, but by 1912, 1913, mining disasters, outdated equipment had pretty much put the company on the rocks. Bankruptcy was followed by revival efforts, by bankruptcy, by let's try it again. About this time, mining engineer, metallurgical engineer George Rapelier came to the area. He got bitten by a snake, was in the hospital, met a young lady, got married, moved to Dayton, and wound up as manager of what was then the Cumberland Coal and Iron Company. Rapelier was charged with resurrecting the business or shutting it down. One unfortunate, troubling story, you might say, is that several years after things went completely bankrupt and closed, people were doing some research and found out that the company's last coal mining effort stopped about 3 feet from a coal seam that would have carried the company in for another 10, 15 years or so. By that time, it was too late. But Rapelier and others in town were trying to do something to boost the economy. The economy in Dayton and Ray County was dead, practically. So he was working on something. Okay, let's move north a few hundred miles to New York City. There was an organization in that town that nobody had ever heard of, looking for publicity, looking for a way to make a name for themselves. The American Civil Liberties Union needed help, and they had a hand in all of this. We'll get there in just a minute. But to really understand the trial, we have to back up a little bit, take a 30,000-foot view instead of a 13,000-foot. 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. and caused something of a stir in particularly the educational community. By the late 1800s, the theory of evolution had really gotten introduced and fairly well accepted in the academic community. Theologians were wrestling with it. What do we do? How do we compare Darwin's ideas to what the Bible says? So by 1925, with the rise of public high school education particularly, Darwin's theory was making its way to where you and I would have at least been familiar with the idea. Students were learning about it in the high school, and that was causing some debate among kids, among teachers, among parents. Is this something that we want our students to learn? Well, part and parcel of the whole thing was the religious aspect. Is the record in the Bible an accurate account of where we came from? Or does Darwin's theory more accurately tell us what we need to know about ourselves? By 1924, 1925, this was something that was being debated publicly. You can read newspaper articles of that time where reporters covered sermons about Darwin and evolution and this sort of stuff. A Tennessee representative, John Washington Butler, heard about a young woman who went to college, studied evolution, came home and said, well, I'm no longer a Christian, I'm an evolutionist. Mr. Butler thought that that was not something that should happen in an institution supported by public tax dollars. And so, over Christmas of 1924, Butler sat down, he sat at his kitchen table, and wrote out what became known as the Butler Act. His proposal was that no public school supported in whole or in part by tax dollars should teach any theory of human origins that contradicts the account that's in the Bible, and then for them to teach instead that human beings were descended from a lower order of animals. The bill was introduced on January 21st, 1925, when the legislature came back into session. By March, about 14th, it had passed both houses and went to Governor Austin Peay, and it sat on his desk for about a week. Now the thought is that Governor Peay was a supporter of education. He was kind of waiting for somebody to come up and say, Governor, you might not want to sign this bill. Nobody did, until after the fact, of course, but he finally signed it on March 21st with the comment, okay, the legislature has had its say. We've not got anything in our textbooks or in our curriculum that's going to cause a problem. We'll never hear about this ever again. Except for those folk up in New York. On May 4th, 1925, the Chattanooga Daily Times published an article from the ACLU announcing that they were looking for a Tennessee teacher who would be willing to challenge the law. There was a provision in the state law that a teacher could make such a challenge without jeopardizing his or her job. They saw this as a way to attack a law that they didn't like, get some publicity, and maybe make a name for themselves. Well, George Rapplier saw that article on May 4th, and he called his friend Frank Earl Robinson, who was proprietor of the drugstore in town, where if you wanted to know what was going on in Dayton, You went to Robinson's drugstore. You'd find somebody who knew what you needed to know. Robinson called himself the hustling druggist because his daughter said he was always looking for a way to boost his business, boost his community, really make things happen. Robinson also happened to be chairman of the school board, which was pretty convenient as it turned out. So Rapplier calls Robinson, Effie, did you see the paper this morning? Yeah, what are you talking about? Yeah, well, did you see that thing about evolution? No, he hadn't. So they got together. Rapplier explained that, you know, maybe we could do this. Maybe we could have a trial, and maybe we could get a little publicity and let people know what a wonderful place Dayton is, and, you know, get the business and investment that we need. Well, you got to have a teacher. And they went to the high school principal, who was also the biology teacher, asked him, would you be interested in being our test case? And Mr. Ferguson said, no thank you, which left the guys in the picture there kind of scratching their heads, what do we do? Well, there was this young kid, Scoops, Scopes, that's right. John Scopes had come to work in Dayton in about August, first of the school year, 1924. The football coach had resigned. They were looking for somebody to take his place. He was hired as a football coach, baseball, basketball coach. Oh yeah, and occasionally he taught math, chemistry, and general science. You know, Ray County had its priorities straight even then. But they asked Scopes, would you be willing to be our defendant? Well, sure, I'll do it if you can prove I taught it. Because in talking this through, Scopes said, I really didn't remember teaching evolution. Now that gets a little interesting down the way, but that's okay. We'll work around that problem. We can handle that. So they contacted the ACLU. We've got our defendant. You've got your case. And they spent the next couple of months in New York and in Dayton organizing the trial. Who's going to prosecute? Who's going to defend? The World Christian Fundamentals Association was meeting in Memphis about that time. One of their issues was evolution. They were, can I say, violently opposed to the Darwinian theory. And William Jennings Bryan had spoken at their conference. The leaders of that group asked him if he would be willing to help prosecute, to help represent the World Christian Fundamentals Association's interest at the trial. He said he would. Well, that made all of a sudden this little case in this little town nobody'd ever heard of a big deal. As you all are well aware, there was nobody in Ray County or in the United States better known than Bryan. Well, with Bryan's entry into the case, Clarence Darrow got interested. Darrow, you know, as I'm sure we all know, was probably the greatest criminal lawyer America has produced. There are people who say ever, but he was the one you went to if you wanted to get off. He just had a knack for saving his defendants. The ACLU didn't want him. Darrow was an atheist or agnostic. The ACLU at that point was largely supported by Quakers and other religious pacifists. And the ACLU folk were afraid that if we have this atheist agnostic on our payroll, so to speak, fundraising. And so they made it very clear that they didn't want him. Scopes, on the other hand, said with Brian in the fight, I knew I needed a street fighter, not a gentleman lawyer. And he told the ACLU, in essence, either Darrow stays or I go. The ACLU decided they needed Scopes more than they didn't need Darrow. So by the time Judge Ralston called court to order on July 10th, this had become a sensation. More than 100 reporters, their estimates of up to 200 reporters, came to Dayton to cover the trial. WGN Radio leased wires between Dayton and Chicago at a cost of approximately $1,000 a day to broadcast the trial. And as a result, this became the first American trial broadcast live over a national radio network. I met a couple, a number of years ago, who said their parents heard that broadcast, I think they're up in this area somewhere, were so taken by the descriptions of Tennessee that they actually moved to Middle Tennessee as a result. Not that it helped Dayton at all, but Tennessee got a few more people. There were something like 65 telegraphers that came into town and sent somewhere around 200,000 words a day during the trial across the country to Europe and Australia. And about Scopes. You can't be here without mentioning him. He was a graduate, of course, of Salem High School, class of 1919. William Jennings Bryan was the commencement speaker at that graduation. I don't know what the exact story is, but Scopes and some of his classmates sitting there during the program burst out laughing or something, and they had to calm them down. Anyway, 6 years later, when Brian came to Dayton, the Dayton Progressive Club threw a banquet and welcomed him. Brian and Scopes wound up sitting across the table from each other. And I would, sure love to hear that conversation. But the best we know is that they talked about 1919 in Salem, and Brian is supposed to have said something like, let's not get carried away this time. But they were friendly. So anyway, July 10, 1925, Judge Ralston calls court to order. The defense argued that the prosecution, argued that the only thing the state needed to prove to get a conviction was that Scopes broke the law. The law says don't teach evolution. He taught it. The defense, on the other hand, said the law violates the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, violates academic freedom of teachers, that to get a conviction, they would have to prove that Scopes taught evolution and concurrently, actively, overtly taught that the Bible is wrong. Well, that gets kicked around for a few days. The first day, the court spent getting Scopes re-indicted. He had been indicted end of May, 1st of June, by a grand jury whose term had expired. So we don't want anything improper here going on in the law. So the judge impaneled a new grand jury. They re-indicted Scopes and spent the rest of the day picking the jury. Now the jury wound up being 10 farmers, a farmer teacher, and a shipping clerk. There were 7 Baptists, 3 Methodists, 1 member of the Christian church, and one with no church affiliation. Darrell was not real impressed with the religious bent of the jurors, but he took it anyway. Now, the lawyers argued over motions for the next couple of days, and then on the fourth day, the state called its witnesses. Walter White, who was superintendent of schools, Harry Shelton, and Howard Morgan, who were students of Scopes, and Robinson, school board chairman and the hustling druggist. All of them testified that Scopes had either taught or admitted teaching evolution. Now there's one little interesting story. They really didn't want the students to perjure themselves. So a few days before the trial, and we hear it two different ways in Dayton. Either Darrell and Scopes got together in a taxi cab and drove around town for an hour or two while Scopes went over the theory. And then the other is that they met probably at the defense headquarters and did that. I like the taxi story just because it sounds cool. But anyway, they spent some time tutoring the students so they would be okay. It's always puzzled me, and I really would love to have asked somebody, what did they do with Walter White and Effie Robinson, who swore that Scopes admitted teaching it? When Scopes says, I don't remember teaching it, but you know, we're not going to let the facts get in the way of a good story here, so let's go for it. The defense called, after these testified, the defense called Dr. Maynard Metcalf, who was a zoologist from Oberlin College. He'd been at Johns Hopkins, was getting ready to go back to Oberlin. Dr. Metcalf testified that he knew just about every zoologist, biologist, geologist of any standing in the country. They were all evolutionists. The only thing they disagreed on was what was the exact process of evolution. But the judge said, okay, that's enough. The state objected to testimony because, you know, who cares what scientists believe if the law says you can't teach it? So the judge eventually accepted that argument, rejected the constitutionality argument, saying that constitutionality is a decision for the appellate courts to resolve. We'll let them look at it when it gets up there. But they finally said, okay, you know, here are the issues, here's the testimony that the scientists and the theologians would argue, would present if you let them testify, entered as affidavits to the record. That left the defense in a tight spot. They wanted to get something on the record. So on the seventh day, they called Brian to take the stand. I'm not supposed to say dirty words in church, but if you've seen Inherit the Wind, the dirty words, you get an idea of what I mean. Brian was called to testify to get Scopes off. What happened in the movie did not happen in the trial. Let me just put it that way. That's why I say it's kind of like dirty words in Dayton. So, but the interesting thing here is by day 7, everybody knew Scopes was going to be convicted. So most of the reporters had left town. At the end of the day, Scopes actually helped a number of reporters write and file their stories with the newspapers and the wire services. So if there are any aspiring journalists here, stick around till it's over. Not a real good idea to leave early. But anyway, Brian agreed to testify if the next day he could put Darrow and other defense lawyers on the stand and ask them similar questions. Brian and Darrow, about 2 years before this, had an exchange in the Chicago papers, and we saw some of that come back to light in 1925. Brian wanted to do to Darrow what Darrow was about to do to Brian. The defense attorneys agreed. Brian took the stand outside. It was, okay, these are some of the scientists who testified. The Ray County Courthouse was not air conditioned then. It was one of the hottest summers on record, and by day 7, the judge decided, we're going to move court outside this afternoon. So we went from an audience of somewhere around 600 to 800 people in the courtroom to, I've heard estimates of 3,000 to 5,000 people on the courtyard. For about 2 hours that day, Darrow asked Brian what has been described as the village skeptics questions about religion, Christianity specifically. Where did Cain get his wife? Did Joshua really make the sun stand still? Noah's flood, did that kill every living thing on earth? How many people were there on earth 2,000 years ago? How many